This is Dennis Ramundi. I'm here with my co-host, Phil Goldberg, author of American Veda. You're listening to Spirit Matters at spiritmatterstalk.com. Our guest today, Ed Sarath, who is a professor of music in the Department of Jazz and Contemporary Improvisation at the University of Michigan School of Music, and also director of the University of Michigan Program in Creativity and Consciousness Studies. He is a very accomplished performer and composer, and his most recent book, Improvisation, Creativity and Consciousness, Jazz as an Integral Template for Music, Education, and Society. Ed, thank you so very much for taking the time to talk to us today.
My pleasure to be with you guys.
Ed, we want to talk a lot about your book, and which covers a lot of ground: improvisation, creativity, and consciousness. And there's a lot in there about spiritual development and so forth. Maybe you could begin by giving our readers an idea of your own background and how you came to this kind of work as both a scholar and a jazz artist.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start. I'm trying to think now how far back I should go. Well, I came up largely with classical training up through high school, and even when I began as a music major. And but towards the end of high school, I started getting interested in jazz, and then it hit me like a freight train. And for many years, actually, I was certainly through graduate school. I got my master's degree in classical performance. I was one of these people that had aspirations of doing both jazz and classical music, and for lack of better terminology, world music and all this kind of thing. But the jazz really took over, and then I became, around the same time, towards the end of undergraduate school, became involved in meditation practice, and after a little while, I started realizing the profound connections between improvisation and meditation, and that actually sort of serves as key to the book, in which I look at the jazz tradition and its long history of leading practitioners who are very interested in contemplative engagement. We have a very nice interplay between what I call the parts to whole improvisation-based creativity and the whole to parts meditation-based spiritual development, consciousness development. So that's the short answer to something that there are many sort of little side trips that could be made there, and maybe we'll make some of those.
Right.
I'm sure we will.
Yeah, Ed, I'm a person that is not particularly creative, but I really enjoy the creative process. I really enjoy listening to creative people and listening to them perform, especially in music. In jazz, one of the big elements is improvisation. You obviously go into a room, you play, and you pick up on the vibes, the audience, whatever's going on. And is there any way you can teach that? You get a student, is there a way to teach them the skills, the intuitions, and whatever else makes up somebody who is good at improvisation?
Well, this is such an interesting question, and it comes up. It's nothing new, but it seems like it's coming up more and more as improvisation is something that is being viewed as something that's not unique to music. It's the business world, and I just gave a talk at the University of Michigan Medical School a year ago, and commonly give talks on improvisation to cross-disciplinary audiences. So everyone, the improvisation is kind of it's like the new buzzword. But I think when we can look at improvisation across fields, and there are certain observations we can make. And one is that there definitely is this intuitive flow that maybe some people are born with an inclination towards more than others, but that can be cultivated. And that's where the meditation and that kind of practice can really help. But then there's also, and this is what a lot of people don't realize, there's a rigorous kind of chops that you can't get around.
Right.
I mean, you look at. I like to compare improvisation music to sports. We just saw the NBA championship, and you cannot find a more improvisatory sport, with the exception of maybe ice hockey, than basketball.
Right.
And And when you look, and we have these stereotypes of the, in this case, LeBron James's, or before him, Michael Jordan or Wayne Gretzky, say a Miles Davis who, just had this raw talent. But the thing is, when we look a little closer, I mean, these guys are the hardest working guys.
Right.
These guys get to into the practice room or get to the ball field earlier than everyone else, and they stay later. And so there's two aspects of it. You do have this intuitive flow, I think, as you described it, but also there's the craft of it is really just as important. And the thing I love in terms of teaching and just sort of thinking about these things is how these two things go together.
So there's a kind of interplay between structure and form on the one hand, and freedom and looseness on the other. It sounds like, and if I'm interpreting some of the material in your book correctly, with respect to transcendence or deep spiritual experience, it sounds like creativity, or in your case, improvisation, could be an entry point, almost like a spiritual practice of its own, an entry point to transcendence. And at the same time, it's a kind of outcome of deep spiritual experience. The one would seem to feed on the other. Am I correct?
Oh, that's absolutely true, and that's the parts to whole principle. Is that the parts, meaning that we're engaging in a very localized kind of intensive mental, physical, emotional, creative flow, and this opens up to this more expansive, transcendent experience. And then, with more overtly, more explicitly spiritual or consciousness-based practice, we do the opposite. We step out of the stream of the parts and delve right into the whole. And that in turn, over time, as I know you guys know this, is then informs this wholeness in the realm of the parts. So we have the best of both worlds.
And I'm fascinated by jazz, and I think about it a lot, and I fantasize maybe in another life as coming back as a jazz musician. But like you said, you have to have the chops.
You could do that. I'll be the basketball player.
You have to have the skill, be able to actually play the instrument and do whatever you want with it. So the way I see it, is that people have these, the great musicians have these incredible internal experiences, and then they have the practical skills, the techniques to communicate that to the audience, and then they feed off the audience. And one thing in the evolution of jazz, and I'd like you to shed some light on this for me, there are performers and performances and groups, and it's almost like they're talking to each other through their instruments. And sometimes the audience locks in and grooves with it. Other times it becomes so abstract, the audience is lost. What are your thoughts on that? And could that be used as a criticism, or is it better that people that perform like that only perform for more sophisticated, more educated audiences? Your thoughts on that?
Well, this is boy, we could have a whole symposium on this and probably be more confused than we were at the beginning. But it's like that's how they describe consciousness studies,
Right.
But this is such an interesting question, Dennis. And I've thought about this a lot because you really hit on a major issue in say contemporary arts, and I think the bottom line is that the creative artist is tapped into a dimension of consciousness, a spiritual awareness, or whatever, that is linked not only with the audience in a given location, a given performance episode, but sort of you might say the pulse of the times. The really profound artist is in touch with that and is able to create from that space a kind of expression that will certainly at times stretch the boundaries of the audience, but at the same time be flowing from such a deep source that it goes beyond sort of mere entertainment. It really enables, and I've had this experience sometimes with ensembles that played some music that would really stretch the boundaries In fact, I've had two experiences that actually exemplified the good and the bad of what we're talking about. I've had experiences that the music was so out that we lost the audience, and the question is, was it worth it? And the answer, maybe performers don't tend to give, but that I would say is no, it wasn't. We were just sort of maybe indulging in something that was disconnected from the deep source. But I've also had the experience where in fact, I've had this many times where the music would be music that listeners would come up and say, "I've never heard music like that." In fact, even the comment that if somebody told me that this was the kind of music it was going to be, I wouldn't have come, or something like that. But it took me away. It really had a profound experience. So I think of it in terms of this is really the obligation of the artist to tap into that place that is really transcendent these kind of surface categories and judgments about whether it's innovative, whether it's conservative, or all that, because all those are isolated facets of something that encompasses all of those possibilities. Deep art is going to have conservative aspects, and it's also going to have boundary stretching aspects. And when they're integrated, and they could only be integrated from this deep grounding, then the impact is transformational.
Great answer. Yeah.
I'm picking up on that, Ed. Back when I was young and a pseudo hipster in college, I went to a lot of jazz concerts and clubs, and I once had the privilege of watching John Coltrane, and I know that he is one of the paramount jazz artists who you refer to as having been involved in meditative practices. He and his wife Alice, of course, and I researched them a bit for my book. And I know there are others. But one of the things that's interesting is what you just said. We associate meditation or contemplative practice with sort of peace and harmony, and yet some of the music that would come out of people like Coltrane, who was a dedicated practitioner, would not sound peaceful and contemplative to people. It's the sort of not like New Age music or something. Can you give us specific examples, perhaps, of some of the artists you're thinking of in those regards? And well, you can't play their music on the air at the moment, but maybe you can be a little more specific about that.
Well, what I would say is that there's sort of stereotypical associations between, as you said, New Age music and all that, and the, sort of the inner experience and all that. But that is really superficial, because when we look at, let's step back from music for a second. When we look at the spiritual adepts, they were very dynamic individuals. Incredibly dynamic individuals who are risk takers and who are always on the outer edges, envisioning in this sort of thing. And so, that really dispels the stereotypes. So to me, actually the Coltranes are the more representative ideal of sort of this coexistence of deep inner experience and full engagement in the turbulence of life. And Coltrane's music there was a kind of turbulence, but there were also moments of, of repose, you might say, in terms of, it wasn't all high intensity and all that. And I think, and it's interesting too, because Coltrane, we always have to look historically too, that Coltrane was driven by a force of blasting away boundaries. And so in that phase, there was a lot of focus on the so-called sheets of sound and that sort of thing. But when we look at, I'm thinking about somebody like a John McLaughlin, who, the guitarist who would, in fact, Phil, I think you have a nice section on him in the book too, don't you?
Yeah.
And he, even though he's a guitarist, he describes himself as a post-Coltrane or a Coltrane disciple. And his music is a great example of just the most ferocious chops. I mean, it's like, oh my God. at the same time, there's like exquisite stillness in the music too. So it's yeah, I think it's important to kind of again the as things move, as things progress in terms of creativity and consciousness development, the idea of all possibilities definitely comes in as a guiding and inspiring principle.
Mm-hmm. Right. And it seems that there's more fusion, less of a boundary between jazz and rock and classical and all the different musical genres and I picked up on this speaking to some young musicians. Is that the case that at one time jazz was more in its own category, rock was in its own category, classical, whatever, and that now young musicians tend to go from one genre to the next, and how does that hurt the purity of jazz or an improvisation, or is it a good thing?
Well, this is a kind of a hot topic too, and the thing we have to keep in mind is that every musical tradition that we know of, including I always go back to like say North Indian, Hindustani tradition is sometimes referred to as Indian classical music, and the thing is, it's a result of the collision. It's a result of the Islamic, invasion of India, maybe 800 years ago or something like that, where you had, the strong Mideastern cultural and musical influence came and divided Indian, certainly musical culture in between, North Indian and South Indian music. So even somehow this tradition that is always, often touted as being, sort of pure and all that is actually not that old in its current form. So every musical label that we can come up with is really it's sort of like the most recent way that we categorize this evolutionary flow. But there's another aspect of this that's related to what we were just talking about, and that is the difference between sort of superficial linkages between different kinds of music, kind of gimmicky kinds of things. Mm-hmm. You have this a little bit with sometimes classical musicians who are trying to expand their boundaries will take some little sprinkle of jazz or something like that, or maybe some world music,
right?
And as opposed to the real organic synthesis that that comes again from that operating from that deep space, and you go back saying among classical composers you can see like certainly going back to Debussy and Ravel, who were influenced by gamelan music and up through Stravinsky and Bartok and all that. You see a kind of organic synthesis that that you'll see, also with, say, the John Coltrane's and McLaughlin's and people like that. That's a very different thing. It's a very different thing. But again, the sort of the melding, the confluence, is really that's the core of what's going on. Actually, it's not the categories are really the byproduct of that.
Ed, I'm really glad you brought up North Indian classical music. I don't know the history so much, but I do know that I remember spending a lot of time in jazz clubs and being entranced not just by the music, but by watching the players and how they miraculously seemed to know what one another was thinking and what they were about to do. And then when I saw Indian musicians like Ravi Shankar, I had the same experience. And I'm told that what we think of as classical music, Western classical music, was more improvisatory back when Beethoven and Bach and so forth were actually playing. Did you bring that into your study of improvisation, or did
this is one of my favorite topics, Phil, and I actually go into this in my book because in fact, I do a lot of speaking around the world actually now on a lot of these things. And when I'm addressing classical audiences, I like to kind of challenge them a little bit, and I say that if you're a classical musician and you improvise, you're kind of a weirdo, 200 years ago, if you were a classical musician and you didn't improvise, you'd be even more of a weirdo. And you're right. It was at the heart of the classical tradition. And the thing with integral theory is that, my book is the first to actually apply integral theory to music. The thing about integral theory is it gives us an incredible way to map this. I mean, basically, what's happened is that, as Ken Wilber would put it, the process spectrum of he doesn't go into music to this degree, but the principle remains. The process, you had this kind of an organic differentiation, which is at the heart of evolution, succumb to a dissociation between these performance and creation in the classical tradition. And now what's happening is that these things are jazz is actually bringing improvisation back in Western music. And you see signs of it in the classical world.
Mm-hmm. And I wanted to ask you, the great innovators in jazz, like Louis Armstrong, like Duke Ellington, what allowed them, what caused them to be as innovative as they were? Was it that they had just incredible technical ability? Did they have a different kind of experience in their lives that they were expressing through music? Did they pick up on something in the collective consciousness of the world that was shifting? When I talk to jazz musicians, I always refer back to Louis Armstrong, and certainly I've always loved listening to him. I'm sure people that, like yourself, can appreciate him much more deeply than I can. But what was it about them? Was it the point in history that they existed in that allowed them to do what they did and have such a long, lasting influence?
Well, in my book, I have a chapter called Innovation, and it's called Individuation. And the basic idea is very much a kind of a Jungian idea. And the basic idea that applied to creativity is that we all have the potential to evolve a personal voice that is deeply rooted in consciousness. This is roughly equated to Jung's thought. Now, I distinguish between innovation and individuation and innovation. Individuation is something that is sort of like everyone's personal obligation, not just in creativity or music, but in every aspect of life. And it's sort of like a localized version of enlightenment. You might think, you might say. I kind of draw that connection. But then you're talking about the innovator, and the point I try to make is that innovation is a special case of individuation that involves the alignment of the sort of the personal horizons, growth horizons of the artist, and I like that you mentioned collective consciousness because there's something very profound there. There's the innovating artist also is aligned with the needs of the collective consciousness for something new to come out. And so it's not, in fact, I use Coltrane as an example. It's not that Coltrane said, or Louis Armstrong or Ellington, as you mentioned, it's not that any of these innovators consciously said, I'm going to innovate. I have a choice to either, I can do this, I can just be a mere lowly individuator, or I can be an innovator. It was the natural flow. And innovation is really more of a byproduct of that profound artist going deep into his or her creative reservoir and coming up with something that speaks to the world in a very profound way, and in a sense kind of ushers in a new era of practice. But it's not something that they consciously try to do.
Mm-hmm. Ed, you mentioned integral theory, and I know that that forms a kind of frame for your book. And the very first chapter in your book is the AQAL framework, which is associated with Ken Wilber. For those in our audience who are not familiar with Wilber's work or integral or AQAL, maybe you can give us a brief Wilber 101 Cliff Notes.
This is okay. I'm earning my money now.
Yeah.
All right. Well.
In 25 words or less, yeah.
Just kidding. One of the things I'm most proud about is that I actually came up with a one-sentence definition of integral theory, and I'll give it to you right now. Hopefully I get it right. It's a great challenge. It's like first lay out the one-sentence version, then the one paragraph, then the one page, and then you can go off to the races. So integral theory maps the inner and outer dimensions of human and cosmic reality, human potential and cosmic reality. So there's 3 parts to it. 2, this is all one sentence, so the process scope that is required to navigate the inner and outer dimensions of reality. And then 3, the evolutionary dynamics that describe, you might say, or guide this growth over time. So the first part of it.
I want to first compliment you for the creativity of making all that one sentence.
Well, you had a little commentary here with so, but actually the sentence, I think I may use a few semicolons, but it's actually
it's a sentence.
It's even
a sentence nonetheless. Yeah.
But just to do just a bit into it more. So inner and outer. Okay, so there's an outer world, there's an inner world, and we yoga, the integration of the inner and outer. 2, the process scope. We have to, if we're going to navigate this expanded realm of human and cosmic potential, we need to have the proper vehicles, and so this is we need the meditation practices. We need the creative engagement, the creativity in the arts. We need the rigors of science and all that kind of thing. So that's kind of like right in there. You have the 1, 2, the first, second, and third perspectives of integral theory, and by the way, the Aquil is sort of an elaboration of it's a 4-part elaboration of the 3 perspectives, and then what an interesting part, and I think a really overlooked aspect of integral theory is the third aspect here of the evolutionary scale. So going back to, say, European classical music, it maps beautifully on the integral progression from pre-modern to modern to postmodern to integral. And basically, classical music, when improvisation fell by the wayside, and you had the ascendance of the art object, and it's an amazing collection of art objects. This was a movement into a very firmly modernist phase in the classical tradition. Improvisation coming back is a postmodern move, and then of course everything culminates in the integral, because you see in classic and contemporary, say from the mid 20th century, a little bit before that, I guess, on, the so-called new music movement in classical music, which is decidedly postmodern, that actually disconnected itself, and this is all consistent with sort of the broader cultural analysis, disconnected itself with its prior roots. And then in the integral phase, you have the improvisation coming back, and you still have the canon of composed music and all that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So that's it's a really that's probably the quickest version of integral that you're ever going to get. And
subject matter for an entire show. Hey, Ed, if somebody's listening in now and they're a young musician and they have a lot of potential, a lot of skill, and they get inspired and they think, I'm going to put my heart and soul into being a great jazz musician, what advice do you give that person?
First, immerse yourself in the recorded legacy, and of course go to as much live performance as you can. But you have right now, you just have an unbelievable repository of recordings, and immerse yourself because you have to internalize the language, and from a consciousness-based standpoint, this is not just superficial aspects of the language, but actually what you might call deep structures that go way, way deep in consciousness that you can really only get. You can't get by reading a book. You can't get by even practicing. Because you're going to have to practice. This is going to be the number 2. But have to come orally. The second thing is then you have to become launched on a rigorous program of mastering your instrument and mastering those language structures of jazz. So those 2 things in themselves would be a good start.
Ed, let's shift from the aspiring musician to advice for the listener, what advice would you give to somebody who wants to see if they can have a deep experience of the kind you talk about and allude to as a listener of jazz and a greater appreciation, A, and B, the B question is, if that listener had to hear only one jazz album, which would it be?
Great question.
Well, this is worse than the integral question, or it's better. This is great. Well, okay, so the first thing I would see, because you run into people that, I hate jazz, I tried it, or, the same thing with meditation, I tried it once, and the thing that we have to realize is that there are many, many, many types. And you have to, so this is leading into the second part of your question, you have to look around a little bit, because there's so many types of jazz. Some are, some are like overtly rooted in sort of blues and mainstream practices. Then there's all kinds of global offshoots and all that. And so say if you're somebody that is coming up through, from a background in maybe popular music or maybe even, maybe new age music or something like that. For instance, there's what's called the ECM jazz movement, which started in, it actually is named after a record label in Europe that started probably in the 70s, maybe late 60s. That is kind of like a really interesting and just powerful blend of not necessarily European classical music, but European folk music and jazz. And there's some, Jan Garbarek is probably emblematic of that tradition, the saxophonist. So generally speaking, I would say really go on a kind of a quest for finding your entryways, and then once you find something that is kind of brings you into the jazz universe, things will open up inside, and you'll have a more expanded receptivity to other forms of the music. Mm-hmm. And from this is I think an important detour here is that, and this is from a spiritual standpoint. In 1987, when I joined the faculty at Michigan, the House of Representatives, you guys might have heard about this, passed a bill, H.R. 57, which basically declared jazz as a national treasure that needs to be preserved. And it's really beautifully written. You can Google it, and they just reiterated it a few years ago. So it might have been probably the 25th anniversary of H.R. 57. But the thing is, the question is, why is this important? This is important because this is what I've been thinking and speaking about quite forcefully recently. This is an important aspect of the soul of America, and this is not just another kind of music. And this is, and when you look at the world right now, in fact, I'm actually teaching a class in the next winter called Black Music Matters. That is really going into this, because when we look at what's happening in the world in terms of just say the social justice conversation, but there's also profound connections to sustainability here. But just on the social justice front, we really are learning, and of course we don't have to go into the current political scene so much right now, but read between the lines. One of the things that we're learning is that we are, in terms of the social justice, and more particularly the conversation on race awareness, race consciousness, we are basically in the 1860s. And we thought we were in at least the 1960s, if not the 21st century. This has been a really incredible moment. So to me, the jazz question goes way, way beyond music, or I would say it goes through music into something that's very deep in the consciousness of the evolution of our country in a way. This is an amazing moment. So now the second part of
I thought you were evading it.
Oh yeah. So was it specific examples?
If you could pick one album,
the one album.
Oh yeah. Well, you know what jazz musicians pick, but they're not necessarily so concerned about sort of common people, but the population. They pick a kind of blue.
Yeah, that's what I thought you'd say.
That is, and to me, it's always been kind of an interesting choice. But I mean, Kind of Blue might not be a bad place to start.
Miles Davis, we should mention that.
Yeah, Miles Davis and Bill Evans plays piano on the record, and it's really a cast of of greats and all that. But I'm going to tell you now. Here's what I do. In fact, this is actually in response to this question. When I'm giving a lecture or teaching a class to sort of general audiences, there's a record that Bobby McFerrin and Chick Corea did called Play. It's just the two of them, piano and voice. And there's a cut called, and in fact, I'm taking your question a step further. I'm actually giving you not just a single record. I'm giving you a single track. It's a little tune called Blue Bossa. Kenny Dorham is a great trumpet player, and it's just a 12-bar little bossa nova. And what they do with it is so magical and so extraordinary and so both virtuosic, innovative, and utterly accessible.
What's the song called?
It's called Blue Bossa.
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 Yeah. As in Bossa Nova.
Yeah.
Bossa Nova. Yeah.
We'll I look forward to listening to that. And actually, I thought, Ed, if it's at all possible, we discussed this a little bit before we went on the air. If you could close us out today by playing a little bit on your horn.
Sure, I'll do that.
Let me say, it's been a pleasure having you on, and I feel like this is the beginning of a conversation Phil and I would like to continue to have with you, because it certainly stirred up a lot of thoughts in my head about jazz and about music and about consciousness, and I'd like to pursue it further. Phil, any final notes from you?
Yeah, I want to thank Ed for taking the time to be with us. This has been very illuminating, and I want to once again mention the title of his book, Improvisation, Creativity, and Consciousness, Jazz as an Integral Template for Music, Education, and Society. We didn't even touch on education. Another time, Ed.
Right.
Okay.
And this will all be posted up on our podcast, at spiritmatterstalk.com. So, Ed,
play us a few bars.
Okay, sure. Here we go.
Hey, thanks.
Hey, thank you so much.
My pleasure, you guys.
That was Ed Sarath. Thank you again.